Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film. Today we're going to be looking at the video worksheet for the first episode of HBO's series John Adams, the episode entitled Join or Die. Now, there's several things to look at here. Number two, people sometimes put various answers for this, but it's supposed to be that John Adams goes inside and takes off his wig. Nice to see a change in fashion. Almost all prosperous men wore wigs at that time, and judges and lawyers in British courts were required to wear wigs. Indeed, in most cases still have to wear wigs in Britain and some former British colonies. Now, in the late 1700s, wigs largely fell out of fashion. As a result of the American Revolution, the French Revolution emphasizing equality and kind of rejecting old symbols of status like the wig. But some people continued to wear them. John Adams wore a wig as president, as did James Monroe. Although James Monroe made a point of dressing as if it was still the 1770s when he was president between 1817 and 1825 to kind of remind Americans of his role as a Revolutionary War veteran. At one point, wigs were so fashionable and such a sign of prosperity that when men had their portraits painted, rather than concealing the fact they had artificial hair, they made sure the portrait painter actually indicated it. There would be a small seam visible across their forehead where the edge of the wig was. Unusually, George Washington, despite his wealth and prestige, made a habit of not wearing a wig. Now, number three is partly accurate. When the fighting broke out around the Customs House in what became the Boston Massacre, people began ringing the church bells of Boston. That was normally done to alert people to a fire in town, so everybody could rush to try to help put out the fire. Although John Adams was not actually at home when the massacre took place, he had not run out to fight the fire or see the shooting, as depicted in the show. By the time he did reach the site of the massacre, all the bodies and the suspects had been cleared away. Now, number 11 is not entirely accurate for the moment. In the movie, it is stated that 5 men are dead. In fact, at this point, that was not quite true. 3 men died on the spot, but a 4th did die of his wounds the next day. A 5th died 2 weeks later. At the moment this scene depicts, only 3 or 4 men had died, but the principle, of course, is the same. Number 24 and number 25 are technically true. Both the captain and his soldiers were found not guilty of murder. Although, as I mentioned earlier, 2 of the soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter and were punished by being branded on their right thumbs. Number 27, which, in the first blank lists all kinds of things: paper, glass, paint, lead, cards, dice, although, of course, I'd take a couple of those in the blank, are all things taxed by the Townshend Act. And the second blank, repealed, is largely true too, aside from the tax on tea. So that refers to the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties. Number 30, we see a British official being tarred and feathered with the encouragement of John Adams and Samuel Adams and John Hancock. My apologies. Now, in fact, they never publicly encouraged violence of this sort. Some historians debate how much they encouraged it privately. Furthermore, they show black tar being poured on the man. And that's modern tar, a petroleum-based product, which it is part of asphalt. It doesn't melt till it reaches 300 degrees, which could give you a severe scalding, possibly a fatal burn. The kind of tar the colonists used was based on pine tar. They baked the roots and stumps of pine trees. The sap leaked out and was kind of refined, making a yellowy brown colored tar. And furthermore, that melts around 140 degrees, which would be uncomfortable, like a really hot bath, but not fatal. So a small point, but an important one for anyone being tarred and feathered. Number 32, the blank is the war, and of course that's the French and Indian War. 33, they complain the taxes violated their rights as Englishmen, which of course is the idea that you should not be taxed unless you have representatives elected by you to create the tax. And of course the great complaint leading up to the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. 35 through 40 all refer to the coercive acts, of course known in the colonies as the intolerable acts. 35 saying no goods or merchandise may be transported to or bought from any other colony or country. 36, all disturbers of the king's peace are transported to England for trial. Number 37, British soldiers or officers charged with capital crimes will be taken to England or transported out of the colony to receive a fair trial. Number 38, the Massachusetts councils to be immediately disbanded. 39, troops may be quartered or housed in the homes of the citizenry. Number 40, General Thomas Gage, who has just been made governor of Massachusetts, is bringing more troops, 4 regiments of troops. So in theory, about 4,000 men, although realistically probably a bit less, to enforce his acts. Number 41, the Congress meeting in Philadelphia would later be known as the First Continental Congress. And of course, number 43, in which 342 chests of tea were spilled into the harbor by vandals dressed as Indians, refers to the Boston Tea Party, in which, as I've already mentioned, the Sons of Liberty who threw the tea in the harbor were dressed as Mohawk Indians. All this was not really meant to fool anybody, except to the extent that any witnesses being questioned could claim they didn't recognize anyone involved because they were all in disguise. But this was a pretty common form of theater in protests of this kind. Number 44 mentions the Virginia House of Burgesses having chosen deputies for Congress. Technically, that's not true. Lord Dunmore, as I mentioned, had dissolved the House of Burgesses, but they'd continued to meet unofficially. And eventually, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, fled from the colonial capital of Williamsburg and tried to govern Virginia from a Royal Navy ship off the coast of the colony, not very successfully. And number 45 and number 46, saying many of our rights existed even before Parliament existed. These rights are derived from God, or these rights are derived from our Maker. Both of these are nearly direct quotes from documents that John Adams had written 8 years earlier during the Stamp Act crisis. As far as we know, he didn't give a speech upon the occasion of being selected to represent Massachusetts in Congress, although he did love to give a speech, so it's possible he did. But these lines, I'm sure, were chosen because they so strongly resemble lines and certainly ideas in the Declaration of Independence. It's going to be written just 2 years later. And of course, Adams was a member of the committee chosen to write the Declaration of Independence, although of course most of the writing was actually done by Thomas Jefferson.